Andre and our staff at AM Horizons Training Group want to discuss the concept of racial implicit bias. This discussion will not only define this concept, but also provide tools that will allow us to mitigate the negative impacts of racial implicit bias to create equitable and egalitarian systems and communities. A few key characteristics of implicit biases. Implicit biases are pervasive. Everyone possesses them, even people with avowed commitments to impartiality, such as judges. Implicit and explicit biases are related but distinct mental constructs. They are not mutually exclusive and may even reinforce each other. The implicit associations we hold do not necessarily align with our declared beliefs, or even reflect stances which we would explicitly endorse. We generally tend to hold implicit biases that favor our own in-group, though research has shown that we can still hold implicit biases against our in-group. Implicit biases are malleable. Our brains are incredibly complex, and the implicit associations that we have formed can gradually be unlearned through a variety of debiasing techniques. What is implicit racial bias? Let's start by deconstructing this concept of race, a political construct. Race is a governing political construct. Put simply, race is a tool used by governments to manage, count, and administer goods, jobs, services, and money. Race has no basis in biological scientific findings, and governments themselves declare that the concepts of race and ethnicity are not often even based on anthropological or sociological observations. More often than not, governments use the common man rule. Whatever the common man say about race is what we declare race to be. Race and ethnic distinctions change from nation-state to nation-state. Data provides guidance in understanding which groups have priority and which lag and languish in the lower rungs of each of those societies. That lag we will later discuss as the basis of disparities. Explicit and implicit bias. Explicit attitudes are attitudes that are at the conscious level, are deliberately formed, and are easy to self-report. On the other hand, implicit mindsets are mindsets that are at the unconscious level and are involuntarily formed and are typically unknown to us. Explicit bias. Explicit bias refers to the attitudes, behaviors, or beliefs that we have about a person or a group on a conscious level. Much of the time, these biases and their expression arise as direct result of a perceived threat. When people feel threatened, they are more likely to draw group boundaries to distinguish themselves from others. People are more likely to express explicit biases when they perceive an individual or group to be a threat to their well-being. Research has shown that white people are more likely to express anti-Muslim prejudice when they perceive national security to be at risk, and express more negative attitudes towards Asian Americans when they perceive an economic threat. When people perceive their biases to be valid, they are more likely to justify unfair treatment or even violence. This unfair treatment can have long-term negative impacts on its victims' physical and mental health. Implicit bias. Unlike explicit bias, which reflects the attitudes or beliefs that one endorses at a conscious level, implicit bias is the bias in judgment and/or behavior that results from subtle cognitive processes, for example, implicit attitudes and implicit stereotypes, that often operate at a level below conscious awareness and without intentional control. Once people are made aware of their own implicit biases, they can begin to consider ways in which to address them. Scientists have uncovered several promising implicit bias intervention strategies that may help individuals who strive to be egalitarian. Consciously acknowledge group and individual differences, i.e., adopt a multiculturalism approach to egalitarianism rather than a colorblindness strategy in which one tries to ignore these differences. Routinely check thought processes and decisions for possible bias, i.e., adopt a thoughtful, deliberative, and self-aware process for inspecting how one's decisions were made. Identify sources of stress and reduce them in the decision-making environment. Identify sources of ambiguity and impose greater structure in the decision-making context. Institute feedback mechanisms. Increase exposure to the stereotyped group members. For example, seek out greater contact with the stigmatized group in a positive context.